In the vast expanse of the Atherian Concord, warfare was a matter of calculated risk and optimized resource management. The long-lived species that comprised the Concord, the stoic, millennia-old Sylvans, the pragmatic, energy-based Lumina, the adaptable amphibious Hydrians, viewed conflict through the lens of vast timescales and meticulous strategic planning. When faced with overwhelming odds, the logical imperative was always clear: retreat, regroup, and preserve resources for future engagements. Glorious last stands were seen as sentimental folly, a wasteful expenditure of life and materiel that served no practical purpose. Their military doctrines emphasized maneuverability, technological superiority, and the avoidance of unnecessary attrition. Defending a clearly lost position was considered an act of irrationality, a failure of strategic foresight. Surrender, while perhaps unpalatable, was often the most logical course, allowing for the preservation of experienced personnel and the potential for future resistance. Then came the Kryll Hegemony, a relentlessly expansionist empire from the galactic east. Their forces were vast, their technology formidable, and their strategic doctrine brutally simple: overwhelming force and unwavering advance. They encountered the Atherian Concord's carefully planned defenses and, to the Concord's initial surprise, often bypassed them entirely, focusing on key strategic assets and civilian centers. When confronted directly, Concord forces typically engaged in well-ordered retreats, falling back to pre-established defensive lines, adhering strictly to the principles of resource preservation. The Kryll, accustomed to swift victories and the logical withdrawal of their adversaries, found this frustrating but ultimately predictable. Then they encountered humanity. Our entry into the Atherian Concord had been relatively recent, our presence still considered somewhat enthusiastic and occasionally reckless. Our military doctrines, shaped by centuries of often brutal and seemingly illogical conflicts on Earth, emphasized concepts that seemed alien to the conquered: unwavering defense, holding ground at all costs, and the almost romantic notion of the glorious last stand. When a Kryll fleet, having bypassed several Sylvan defense platforms, descended upon the newly established human colony of Nova Alexandria, the Concord High Command expected the human forces to follow protocol, a tactical withdrawal to the nearest fortified system. Instead, the human planetary defense forces, outnumbered and outgunned, dug in. Their communications, filled with defiant pronouncements and determined tactical updates, baffled the Concord observers. They weren't retreating. They were preparing to fight. The battle for Nova Alexandria was, by all logical metrics, a slaughter. The Kryll fleet, a wedge of hulking warships, rained down fire upon the planet's surface. Human defense platforms, while surprisingly resilient, were systematically overwhelmed. Kryll landing craft disgorged heavily armored troops, their advance seemingly unstoppable. Yet, the human defenders did not break. They fought from every fortified position, every makeshift barricade, every ruined building. They used unconventional tactics, ambushing Kryll formations in unexpected locations, utilizing the terrain to their advantage, and displaying a level of ferocity that the Kryll had not encountered in their expansion across dozens of other worlds. Human soldiers, knowing their situation was hopeless, fought with a grim determination. They held their ground until their ammunition ran out, then resorted to melee weapons, even their bare hands. They transmitted defiant last messages, vowing that the Kryll would pay dearly for every inch of ground. The Concord observers watched in horrified fascination. This was not a strategic withdrawal, it was a massacre in slow motion. Yet, there was something undeniably compelling about the humans' unwavering defiance. It was illogical, it was wasteful, but it was also inspiring. Nova Alexandria eventually fell. The Kryll moved on, their advance slowed but not halted. The Atherian Concord mourned the loss of the human colony, viewing it as a tragic but ultimately predictable consequence of humanity's primitive and emotional approach to warfare. However, something unexpected happened. The Kryll, forces that had conquered Nova Alexandria, were depleted. They had suffered significantly higher casualties than anticipated. Their advance had been delayed by several crucial cycles. The seemingly insignificant human colony had extracted a heavy toll. Reports from Kryll command channels, intercepted by Concord intelligence, spoke of unnecessary resistance, irrational enemy behavior, and unacceptable levels of attrition. The Kryll, accustomed to the logic of retreat, had been thrown off balance by humanity's illogical defiance. The fall of Nova Alexandria, though a tragedy, sparked a realization within the Atherian Concord. While their own strategic doctrines were logical and efficient in many ways, they were ill-suited to dealing with an enemy like the Kryll, who relied on overwhelming force and expected their adversaries to behave rationally. Humanity's seemingly irrational commitment to holding ground, their stubborn refusal to surrender even in the face of certain defeat, had proven to be a surprisingly effective delaying tactic, buying precious time and inflicting unexpected losses on the Kryll. Recognizing this unique human trait, the Atherian Concord approached humanity with a proposition: to form specialized units dedicated to planetary defense and last-stand scenarios. These units, composed primarily of human soldiers, would be deployed to strategically vital locations with the express mandate to hold their ground for as long as humanly, and perhaps even inhumanly, possible. Thus, the last-stand specialists were born. These units were given the best available defensive technologies, extensive training in asymmetrical warfare and close-quarters combat, and a clear understanding of their mission: to be the unyielding anchors of the Concord's defenses, the stubborn rocks against which the Kryll tide would break. Human recruits flocked to these specialized units. They embraced the concept of the last stand, viewing it not as a suicidal folly, but as the ultimate test of human resilience and defiance. They trained with a fanatical intensity, honing their skills in defensive tactics, learning to turn every building into a fortress, every choke point into a killing ground. Their motto became a defiant echo of Nova Alexandria: "They shall not pass easily." The first major deployment of the last stand specialists came during the Kryll assault on the vital industrial world of Cygnus VII. Concord fleets engaged the main Kryll armada in orbit, attempting to delay their advance. Meanwhile, human last stand units, numbering in the tens of thousands, had fortified key locations across the planet's surface: vital production facilities, strategic transportation hubs, and heavily populated urban centers. The Kryll landed in overwhelming numbers, expecting a swift conquest. Instead, they were met with a level of resistance they had not anticipated. Human defensive lines, layered and heavily fortified, held firm. Kryll assaults, accustomed to exploiting the swift retreats of Concord forces, found themselves bogged down in brutal urban warfare, facing human defenders who refused to yield an inch. For weeks, the battle for Cygnus VII raged. The Kryll poured in reinforcements, their advance relentless. Concord forces in orbit fought a desperate holding action, but it was the human last-stand specialists on the ground who became the linchpin of the defense. They used their intimate knowledge of the terrain, their improvisational skills, and their unwavering determination to inflict heavy casualties on the Kryll. They employed guerrilla tactics, utilizing tunnels and hidden pathways to strike behind enemy lines. They turned, destroyed vehicles and rubble piles into deadly traps. They fought with a ferocity born of the understanding that retreat was not an option. Concord strategists, monitoring the battle, were astonished. The human units, despite suffering heavy losses, continued to hold their ground, delaying the Kryll advance and inflicting casualties far exceeding expectations. The Kryll, accustomed to the logic of overwhelming force leading to swift victory, became increasingly frustrated and bogged down. The battle for Cygnus 7 became a symbol of humanity's unique contribution to the war effort. The Kryll eventually captured key strategic objectives, but their victory came at a staggering cost in lives and resources. Their timetable for the conquest of the Atherian Concord was thrown into disarray. Humanity's irrational commitment to the last stand had bought the Concord invaluable time, allowing their fleets to regroup and their scientists to develop new anti-Kryll technologies. The success on Cygnus 7 solidified the last stand specialists as a crucial element of the Atherian Concord's defense strategy. Human units were deployed to other strategically important worlds, their presence a clear message to the Kryll. Some worlds would not fall easily. The Kryll, while still powerful, began to adapt their tactics, attempting to bypass human-held fortifications or to overwhelm them with sheer numbers. But even then, the human defenders held firm, their defiance becoming legendary throughout the Concord. Stories of human last stands spread like wildfire. The small squad that held a vital mountain pass for days against overwhelming odds, the engineering team that detonated their fusion reactor to deny a Kryll army a critical supply depot, the civilian militia that fought to the last man and woman to protect their homes. Humanity's seemingly illogical commitment to fighting to the bitter end became a source of inspiration for the other species of the Concord. The stoic Sylvans, the pragmatic Lumina, and the adaptable Hydrians began to incorporate elements of human tenacity into their own defensive strategies, learning that sometimes the most logical course of action is to refuse to yield, even when all seems lost. The war against the Kryll was far from over, but the tide had begun to turn. The Kryll's advance had been slowed, their aura of invincibility shattered, and it was humanity, the species that stubbornly refused to retreat, the specialists in the glorious last stand, who had played a crucial role in turning the tide on. Countless worlds across the Concord, human soldiers stood ready, their weapons charged, their eyes fixed on the horizon. They were the inheritors of a long and often bloody history, a species that had learned the hard way the value of holding ground, of fighting for every inch, of facing overwhelming odds with unwavering defiance. They were the last stand specialists, and they would not yield. For in their stubborn refusal to surrender lay the hope of the Atherian Concord, a testament to the illogical but undeniably powerful human spirit. The logic of retreat had met its match in the unwavering heart of humanity, a species that understood that sometimes the greatest victory lies not in survival, but in the defiant way you choose to fall. And the Kryll Hegemony would learn, world after hard-fought world, that when humans made their stand, the cost of victory was often far too high.